Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the breakout sessions. I glanced in on them and they were really, really quality conversations going on there. So thank you to all of our panelists and wonderful moderators. By the way, if you haven't had a chance yet to visit the virtual exhibits, there'll be another opportunity at 2:45 Eastern when we'll take our next break, and also a chance to visit them during the happy hour beginning at 5 o'clock Eastern. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you a longtime friend of ours, Antigone Davis, to host our next conversation. Antigone is the Director of Global Safety at Facebook, and she spearheads the work of the Facebook Safety Advisory Board. And she will be in conversation with Mary Madden, who is a senior fellow at the Joan, Ganz, Cooney Center, which is part of the Sesame workshop. Antigone, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And I also just want to echo how incredible the conference has been so far. I mean, I'm not only hearing it from my people on my team, but I'm hearing it from other safety folks that I keep in touch with on a regular basis by email and chat. So kudos to the FOSI team. Mary, I'm very excited to get a chance to talk to you and have this conversation with everybody and have about a bazillion questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. I think maybe to tee it off a little bit, you know, we've heard a lot today about the impact of the current time on parenting and on online kids' experience online and how they're dealing with school and a number of different places in which the current pandemic has really shifted grounds a little bit. Some of it negative, some of it positive. I'd like to hear a little bit from you what you think are some of the silver linings from this moment.
Thank you so much, Antigone. And thanks to Stephen and FOSI for inviting me to be here today. I've attended FOSI many times over the years and had the honor of presenting on panels previously, but this is a special honor. Antigone, you and I have been on panels before. I feel like we could do a tour around the country because I always love hearing your perspective from industry, and I'm honored to bring some of the insights from the research we're doing at the Cooney Center here today. So at the moment, for those of you who don't know, the Cooney Center is a research and innovation lab based at Sesame, and we are focused on how to use digital media to improve kids' education, and not just in school, but informal learning as well. And helping to do research that can also be especially applicable to public media and the public media community. So I'll speak today a little bit about some silver linings that we're seeing from a research project we're doing where we're interviewing 50 kids ages 10 to 17 across the country. And as you can imagine, one thing we had to do was adapt our interviewing to the online environment, which also it's been a mixed bag. It's been hard, but there have been some silver linings there. And what we're seeing in these interviews, we're about 2/3 of the way done, is that there are some unexpected positives. And so I think before I get into that, I want to acknowledge the clouds first, right? We are absolutely experiencing unprecedented pressures, families across the country, not only in terms of the virus itself, but associated economic pressures overlapping with those physical realities. And then of course, the strain of having to adjust to online schooling and remote work. However, what we are seeing and hearing from kids is that this is affording new opportunities for them to engage in interest-based learning. They don't say it that way, but it takes the form of things like teaching themselves how to play guitar, you know, learning how to do embroidery, right? Like taking advantage of this vast resource of online content through how-to videos, through connecting with their peers. And so there has been a positive, I think, bucket of opportunities there for kids in formal learning that hasn't really fully been recognized yet, right? Because this is going to have long-term effects on their learning. So that's one positive thing. I think also we're seeing that kids who have different learning styles some of them are really thriving in the online environment. So for all the struggles that we're seeing with connectivity issues and transferring curriculum to online environments, we are seeing that some kids who maybe have a more difficult time with auditory learning cues are thriving with more visual cues. We're seeing that some of the social pressures that kids face in the in-person environment are lessened in the online environment. They might prefer to be able to express their opinions and engage over chat. They say that they don't have the same pressures, social pressures to participate in class in a way that makes them nervous or uncomfortable. So those are some of the early things that we're seeing just with respect to education that I think are really promising. And I think it's important to keep in mind as we are navigating all of these day-to-day challenges that there are some silver linings that are happening as well.
I actually read a really, really interesting piece in the paper the other day about a family that their child had really been struggling with bullying in school, and they were aware of the problem, but once their child was learning from home, they just saw their child kind of blossom in terms of feeling safer to participate, etc., removing some of the avenues that must have been open to the child and open to the bullies in relation to the child. And the parents were actually fundamentally rethinking a little bit how they would approach their child's learning after the pandemic, and really trying to find maybe a new balance where the child had some space to do some learning that was remote or that felt more protected for the child. They didn't realize how much it impacted their actual ability to learn in a class. So I do think there are some real silver linings. You touched on one thing that in terms of just like the actual amount of time that kids are spending on learning. So they're doing their classes either fully, partially, etc., in relation to school. They're also doing some additional screen time for other avenues of interest-based learning, as you mentioned, learning guitar, etc., etc. But that, of course, brings up the screen time question, right? And a little bit, I'd love to hear from you, sort of, how has the pandemic changed the way you're thinking about screen time? I know some conversations about screen time had already changed or were in the process of changing, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about how this particular time period is reshaping some of that thinking and maybe your thinking on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's, I think, fundamentally evolved how so many of us, both in the research community and as parents, are thinking about screen time. Certainly for many years, we've been hearing from researchers like Sonia Livingstone, that the quality of the content that kids are engaging with, the quality of the time that they're spending online is incredibly important to consider. And some of the legacy of how screen time gets discussed in the research community stems from truly the previous research on television watching. And so looking at hours spent watching TV. And we know that, online engagement takes so many different forms. The pandemic has thrust us into the online learning and online working world in such a way that it has fundamentally shifted how we think about opportunities for kids' socialization and how they spend their free time. And what we're seeing in the interviews we're doing with kids across the country is that when we ask them a question about reflecting on how their tech use has changed during the pandemic, a lot of them are saying, initially, I was online a lot more than normal, right? Like mom and dad had to do work. And especially over the summer, I was able to have a lot more screen time than I did previously. And then we're hearing them say things like, and then I got bored, right? Like I watched all the YouTube channels that I wanted to watch and, played all the games I wanted to play. And so then I decided to start riding my bike, and I got a new bike, and now I ride my bike every day with my friends, right? So like we're seeing some of this sort of self-regulation and more increased awareness of digital well-being and setting limits, particularly with older kids. And that when physical interaction is available, that kids want to choose that when they can, right? So I think a lot of families have changed their rules and their thinking about screen time out of necessity. But what that has done is it has sort of flipped the tables, and we've actually been hearing things like kids saying, I look forward to having structure again to my screen time. I look forward to knowing that the weekend is when I get more time, and during the week it's more limited, right? And so I think that's one of those long-term effects that is going to be fascinating, to see how that changes the conversation. And again, I think parents seeing that this is something we've seen in our own lives. I have 2 boys who are 12 and 10. The opportunities for them with socializing with friends through games has been a lifeline, and I can absolutely see the ways in which that has helped them cope, and that's helped mom and dad cope. And so I think that it's really important to consider the quality of their engagement, teaching them those skills about self-regulation, what it means to have, a balance between different kinds of activities. And then I think once this is all over, we'll see a lot of kids choosing, offline activities when they can, and appreciating them in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can say, speaking back towards silver linings, that certainly I have a number of young neighbors right around where I live, and one of the nicest things of late has been that I do actually hear them out in the yard more, playing, screaming at each other, laughing, and clearly to some degree setting their own time boundaries and limits. And so there's some real resiliencies and some self-regulatory skills that seem to be developing, which is great. And I think very, very exciting and promising. I have a question for you, because with kids being better maybe at self-regulating and identifying time boundaries and finding ways to navigate in this new sort of this new time period, nonetheless, parents are still involved, and parents still have to find ways to manage, set boundaries, determine what their controls are going to be in place. And I'd love to hear a little bit from you, what you think some of the implications are for the parental controls, and how we're thinking about parental controls, and what you're seeing from parents in terms of managing kids digital activity.
Yeah, so I think, this goes back to, honestly, some of my research at the Pew Research Center. I like to say to my kids, when they accuse me of not knowing anything about technology, I say, I've been researching the impact of the internet since the turn of the century. In my time at Pew, from the earliest days, and this very well as someone who's been in this space for a long time, there early on was a lot of focus exclusively on formal technological controls. And then, over time, what we found is that, hey, kids are really creative. They find ways to work around a lot of these controls, especially as they get older. And that, in fact, we need to be thinking about a mix of formal and informal controls, and of course, also developing skills and on a sort of spectrum of moving towards more trusting engagement with your kids, right, as they age. And so, I think that in terms of what we're seeing during the pandemic, we saw from the report earlier today, parents obviously feel overwhelmed. They, they are really hungry for more simplified, centralized information that they can act on. Really, I think important is these major moments in a child's life, whether it's the acquisition of a phone or, the first time they get an email address, those moments where your kids are begging you for, the ability to start doing something new, right? Those are kind of gateway moments where you can take more time. And I think it's an opportunity for tech companies to say, okay, here's this moment where the parent and child are in negotiation. We can introduce this, whether it's required interaction and responding to questions, if it's a module of learning, if it's it can be even a template for a parent-child contract agreement, right? Like, and it's also an opportunity to involve the kids in the creation of those agreements and that process, right? Like, and asking kids what they think the rules should be. I always find that both in research and in my personal life to be a really powerful tool, because it forces them to reflect on, okay, if I was the parent, what seems like a reasonable, limit to set, right? And then I think, going back to some of the good parts about this time together, even though we are crowded in our houses and forced to spend maybe sometimes too much time together, we are getting a window into each other's online lives in ways that we don't normally do. And so, parents, I think, have an opportunity for lots of these sort of just-in-time conversations, about whether it's, the way that kids are interacting on a game, and it's a discussion about bullying or digital citizenship, or something like encountering, misinformation on a YouTube video, or, in relation to topics like the election or the pandemic, et cetera, right? So those are opportunities for discussions about how we assess information. And those can be really, really rich opportunities that we can leverage during this time. And we know more generally that, kids and parents are spending more time together and they're talking more. And when those channels of communication are open, also, like, between siblings is another really important, I think, consideration of this time, that siblings have more time together. Yes, they're fighting, but they're also helping each other and mentoring each other, and providing peer support in a way that, isn't always possible when we're running across to town to, soccer games and in our typical busy lives. So I think, that combination of formal and informal supports is really important.
Yeah, I think you're probably right that we can't really underestimate the value also of real in-time conversation. It's so much more valuable to have that moment right as it's happening, to work through a problem with a child, both as a parent, but I mean, even for your child, sort of building the skill itself. If you're working through the problem as opposed to talking about the problem, they really actually internalize those learnings in a different way, which I have to think is great. One of the things that we did early on in the pandemic was to launch something called Get Digital, which is a platform for parents, educators, and kids. And one of the things that this was really designed to do is to give parents an opportunity to go through some lessons and projects and interact, lessons with their kids around some of these issues, and kind of work through them at home right there. And the timing of it actually worked out really well. It had really been focused very much on educators, but it was designed for parents too. And now we were able to offer at the moment that this was happening. So I really do hope people are taking advantage, parents are taking advantage of the different things out there from tech companies like ourselves, and as well as from researchers, et cetera, that are now being put online for parents to really use directly with their kids and interact directly with their kids. So that I do think opens up some new opportunities for learning. One thing I do want to kind of touch on, which we've seen playing out a bit, is a little bit some of the inequities that come when we move to online learning. When not everybody has access, not every parent is in a position. Some parents actually aren't home, even though their children are home learning. And because they have the kinds of jobs that really require that they leave the house. How have you seen that play out? What are you learning about some of the digital inequalities and how we might better deal with them?
That's such an important question. And I think is something that has been dramatically illustrated during this time, which is sort of these multiple dimensions of digital inequality, and that because of the ways in which we were so abruptly thrust into these environments online, and because of what were already pre-existing gaps in both not just internet access, but the quality of access, the quality and newness of devices, the difference in skills and confidence levels, and the difference in the social support to navigate not only the technical challenges, right, but like the emotional challenges that come with dealing with all of the frustrations, right? All of that takes time, it takes patience. And so I think understanding these multiple dimensions of digital inequality, but also with respect to online learning specifically, and how we think about assessing kids in those environments. It's so challenging to think about building in educational equity when you have a student who may be sharing their dinner table with two other siblings. Parents aren't there. This device may not be able to run the software that's needed to complete a certain task, right? So we have to think about leveling up and making sure that there's equality and I think more connectivity across the board so that we can deliver the education and the opportunities that are needed. And this is a real opportunity for this time, for us to recognize the ways in which we weren't prepared, and the ways in which we can do better. And I think, there had been sort of an evolution of the conversation around the digital divide to focusing more on skills. But the connectivity conversation really, I think from a policy perspective, had narrowed a bit to saying, oh, well, this is primarily a rural issue. And no, in fact, we know it's really connected to cost. Yes, it is an issue in rural areas, but cost is the primary factor. And that we also, it's not enough to just get kids, even like in some of the most well-resourced schools, it's not enough to just get them an iPad, right? When you have a complex task that involves multiple applications. And so designing the curriculum, I think, with those differences in mind, and also designing future policy interventions with those differences in mind, so that, hopefully we won't have another situation like this. But I think we need to, both in the research community and the policy community, think long-term about how we can better serve kids across the country, so we don't deal with these challenges moving forward.
So I have actually, just to turn the tables a little bit, we're thinking about some of the resiliencies, or you've talked a little bit about some of the skills and resiliencies that kids have taken in this time period. What do you think, if you look at parents and educators, what do you think are some of the key takeaways or things that you've seen them do really well, or pivot, or resiliencies that they've built, or skills that they've learned during this time period?
Yeah, there are so many. I mean, honestly, and so I do think it's important to elevate those positives, because it's so easy to get weighed down, right, with all of the immense challenges that we're facing. But teachers have been doing amazing things to accommodate their students, and in terms of what we're seeing, working overtime like you wouldn't imagine, right, to completely re-engineer an offline curriculum for online delivery that's happening constantly. Also teaching students these skills around just interacting online, being able to, do simple things like mute yourself, right? How many parents have, heard in the background, so-and-so, make sure you're, unmuting yourself or muting yourself. Also learning about security, right? Like the importance of having an encrypted connection, right? For many of these video calls. And here, not far from us in Fairfax County, early on, they dealt with massive issues of, kids basically trying to mess with the system, and that became a moment of learning, right? And so I think so many things are happening with creative ways to make the curriculum more engaging for kids. I think for parents, so many parents are, I think, finding creative ways to make it all work. And I know certainly in our home, just today, for instance, both parents are giving presentations at conferences, and at the moment, both children are self-managing their online schooling, which, quite frankly, I did not think was possible, and did not seem like it was ever going to work early on in this process. But it was only through, going through that sometimes challenging and awkward learning curve that we got to the place that we're in now, right? So there was a fantastic panel earlier focused on resilience, and I wrote down a quote I wanted to make sure to mention here from Tessie on that panel. She said, "You can't build resilience with avoidance." And people in the chat were saying that's the quote of this entire conference, and I agree. It's so important for kids to learn how to manage through this challenging time, the informational skills that they're going to have to be able to navigate multiple communications platforms, being able to manage both social and emotional development goals, being able to concentrate and focus in otherwise, chaotic environments, right? With, parents and siblings interrupting constantly. Most families are not experiencing, online schooling and online work life in, perfect, quiet office spaces, right? Like most of us are figuring out how to make it work. We're seeing this in our interviews with kids, which we are doing via Zoom. We get a window into what's going on in the background, and how families are, setting up, where they're setting up the computer, how they're, sometimes what they're doing in the background. And it's allowed us to see, this resilience in action. And it's really inspiring. It really helps to put in perspective, I think, and really make human, this time that we're all going through. Just being able to see each other's homes, right, I think is going to have an impact on how we think about work and connectivity moving forward.
We certainly all have come to see our colleagues as full people, right? To really see, not just hear about their families, but to see their families. And it has, I think, completely provided an opportunity for learnings around etiquette. I mean, I have had numerous conversations where someone's child has walked in, or my pet has jumped into the screen, and with your children, it is an opportunity for you to talk to them, like first of all, to introduce them to your work, for them to see that they're actually people you work with, and to see how you manage those conversations, and to learn etiquette, and for them also to set boundaries too with the parents, and to work through online etiquette, and to work through even just challenges of getting technology to work properly. And so I do see among my own colleagues and in the work that I'm doing and with young people, a real, almost like a fast forward on some of these questions that have been plaguing families in terms of how to manage when a parent is involved, when is a child, when do they interfere, when do they not, how do they teach their children about online etiquette. You certainly can talk about it in the abstract. It's much easier to teach when it's actually happening in real time, as you say. The other thing is that I think I'm also seeing technology companies adapt to some of this. Some of it preceded the actual situation we're in right now, but you see things like Messenger Kids from Facebook, where you have a parent-child relationship inside of the technology that's much more interactive. TikTok just announced parental control. So there is a growing understanding of sort of that interaction between parent and child, and how do we build that into technology? How do we build it into our learning, online learning? How do we build it into guidance that we give and resources that we give to families? So in some ways, this has sort of pushed us forward a little bit faster on some growing areas, which I think is very, very exciting. I know we're getting close to the end of time, which is a bummer for me because I know
it's flew by.
But
we need to do this more often.
Are there any parting things you want to make sure to kind of share with the audience before we kind of close out our last 30 seconds or so?
I'm going to quote my my partner and colleague Monica Bolger, who's also a senior fellow at the Cooney Center, which is just to be gentle to one another, right? I think we can't say that enough. Be gentle with your kids, be gentle with yourself. We're going to get through this, and I think you're right. We're going to get through it stronger.
Well, thank you so very, very much, and again, thank you to Stephen and FOSI and the entire crew for putting together an amazing conference and for giving me an opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, and thank you so much, Antigone, for supporting us through these challenging times. Mary, always great to have you at a FOSI conference, and I was pleased that you two got the spotlight. I love your final thoughts about being gentle to each other. I think that's so important, particularly as we go into this very challenging winter ahead of us.